I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of America's last public enemy number one, Alvin Creepy Karpis, the criminal who made J. Edgar Hoover look like a fool, the strategist who never fired a bullet in panic, and the man who outlived every gangster of his era. For decades, Hoover's FBI called him a monster, but behind the headlines was a different kind of criminal, one who saw the Bureau for what it really was. A machine built on fear, politics, and ego. Karpis was calm, he was intelligent and cold. It goes to watch the system that hunted him become worse than the men it chased. This is not a story about bank robberies. It's a story about survival, control, and how one man's legend was rewritten by the government that could not kill him. This is Deadly Truths. In Canada in 1907, Alvin Karpis was born into a cold world, the son of a Lithuanian immigrant scraping by on factory wages. His father drank himself to death when Alvin was a kid. His mother, a maid, spoke little English. Poverty was not a phase, it was geography. By 15, he'd already been arrested for stealing food. By 20, he had been in and out of reform schools across Canada in the Midwest. But unlike the rest, Alvin watched. He did not rage. He studied people, guards, crooks, lawyers, like a lab specimens. The first thing people always got wrong about him was the nickname, Creepy. Came from a nervous grin, not a sadistic heart. The FBI made it sound like something out of a monster movie, but in person, Karpis was quiet, polite, and analytical. He did not drink, he did not gamble, and he did not brag. He was a planner. He was a perfectionist. I never liked blood, he once said. I liked control. The American press would turn him into a boogeyman, but the truth was simpler. Alvin Karpis was what America made when it stopped feeding its poor and started worshiping its outlaws. 1920s, the jobs had vanished and the banks hoarded the money while families starved. And men like Karpis realized that the vaults were full and the law didn't care who went hungry. So he started robbing trains and payroll cars across the Midwest. Not the chaotic shootouts that Hollywood loved. These were blueprints, timed and precise. By the time the Great Depression hit, Karpis was already a ghost on Hoover's radar, a name on wanted posters that never led to an arrest. He teamed up with Fred Barker, the youngest of the dysfunctional Barker clan. They were an odd pair. Fred was impulsive and loud, Alvin calculating and cold, but the partnership worked. Karpis handled logistics, safecracking, and planning. Fred handled muscle. Then came the FBI's gift of propaganda. They labeled them the Barker-Karpis gang. That's the myth Hoover built to make himself look like America's savior. The truth, there was no family gang, just Karpis, a strategist using small-time crooks as pawns. But headlines love mothers and monsters, so Hoover turned Kate Barker into Ma, the criminal mastermind, which I had covered in a prior episode, and Karpis into her snake. Together, they became America's nightmare couple, the invented villains of the federal PR campaign. And Hoover's obsession with image would eventually make Karpis a legend, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the one who got away. By 1933, the economy was a carcass, and the Midwest was gnawing on the bones. The banks that ruined people were still standing, so men like Alvin started knocking on the doors with Tommy guns. But Alvin wasn't into the rush of it. He hated chaos. He thought of crime like chess, a board with money at the end instead of checkmate. That's what made him really dangerous. While the rest of the Depression ran on impulse, Bonnie and Clyde chasing headlines, Babyface Nelson chasing blood, Karpis ran on logistics. The man kept lists, timetables, roadmaps. He knew the cops' radio frequencies, the width of getaway roads, even which gas stations had the slowest attendance. He did not rob banks. He once said, "We robbed bad systems," but the systems didn't see it that way. In 1933, the Barker Karpis crew kidnapped a Minnesota bear baron's son, William Ham. They held him for $100,000 ransom. That's about $2 million today. Ham came home shaken but alive, and Hoover smelled blood in the headline. They needed monsters to justify the budgets. Karpis was one of those people that helped them justify it. The problem was he was organized and uncatchable, and that made it a little harder than usual. Then came the second kidnapping, banker Edward Bremer, early 1934, and that ransom was $200,000. I went over this in a little bit more detail when I was covering Ma Barker. The crime was surgical. Again, no violence, no sloppiness. The drop went smoothly, and Bremer lived. But the crime was a public relations disaster for the government because Edward Bremer's father was a personal friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Hoover, who built his empire on moral panic, suddenly had Washington breathing down his neck. So he declared war. Public enemy number one was born, not because Karpis was the bloodiest, but because he embarrassed the Bureau's budget reports. Hoover went to the press and described him as sinister, cold-blooded, and inhumanely cunning. Translation: the guy keeps making me look bad. Meanwhile, Karpis was reading the papers and laughing. He later said, "Every time Hoover called me a genius, my mother thought I'd finally made something of myself." But behind that humor, things were cracking. The Barker Karpis crew had grown too famous to hide. Alvin's meticulous planning started to fail under the weight of the constant pressure. Every car, every room, every meal came with paranoia. Who was watching? In 1935, the FBI stormed the Barker hideout in Florida, and they did kill Ma and Fred Barker in a shootout that made front page news nationwide. Hoover personally fed the papers the story, the mother and the son crime duo, America's nightmare put to rest. The problem: Karpis was not there. He left 2 days earlier, bored and annoyed with the sloppiness. When he saw the photos in the paper, he reportedly said, "That's what happens when amateurs play professionals." Hoover, of course, didn't mention that. He could not, because for all his speeches about the Bureau's victories, Alvin Karpis, the last original public enemy, was still out there, and he was still one step ahead. By 1936, Karpis was the last man standing. Dillinger was dead, Nelson riddled with bullets. Bonnie and Clyde turned into Swiss cheese on a Louisiana road. The FBI made martyrs of them all, and Hoover was now running out of enemies. But Karpis, he refused to die. And he was not a hero like Pretty Boy Floyd. He was too quiet for newspapers to love him and too smart for Hoover to catch him, which made him the most dangerous man alive, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. A criminal the system could not control or find. And Hoover hated that. He needed one final scalp to solidify his empire, the one public enemy who kept embarrassing him on front pages. So the FBI went full throttle. Informants, phone taps, fake telegrams. The Bureau even leaked false sightings to the press just to see where rumors spread, a crude form of social engineering decades before the term existed. And finally, they got a tip from a small-time crook named Doc Moran, one of Karpis's old safe house contacts. Alvin was supposedly in New Orleans, laying low, driving a brand new Plymouth coupe. The Bureau moved fast. Hoover demanded to be on site, not because he needed to be, but because he wanted his movie ending. On May 1st of 1936, federal agents surrounded the car near the intersection of Royal and St. Philip Streets. Karpis had just pulled up when they boxed him in. Two agents ran forward, guns drawn, screaming his name. "Karpis, raise your hands!" And Karpis raised his hands, calm as ever. "You got me," he said. "Don't wreck the car. It's not mine." Hoover, sweating in his tailored suit, with his palm made perfect, face red with victory, strutted in for the headlines. He wanted to personally handcuff America's last public enemy. Only there was one problem. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the most powerful lawman in America, didn't bring any handcuffs. Let that sink in. So his agents had to use a necktie. I love that part. So imagine the photo, Hoover posing with his prisoner, agents smiling for the cameras, and Karpis standing there, bound with a cheap silk tie like a man being arrested by Macy's. Later, Karpis would write, "Hoover didn't even make the arrest. He showed up after I was in custody for pictures. I guess the flashbulbs were his real weapon." Hoover's press team rushed out statements calling it a daring personal capture by the director Hoover himself. Newspapers swallowed it whole. They described Karpis as snarling, cold-eyed, and terrifying. The truth, he barely spoke. He told the agents exactly where his gun was and even warned them about a jammed round in the chamber. He didn't want anyone getting trigger happy. That's how calculated he was, even in defeat. On the plane back to Washington, Karpis was quiet, watching Hoover preen for the press. Finally, one agent tried to make small talk. "So, Alvin, you've been public enemy number one for a long time. What's that feel like?" Karpis looked at him and said, "Feels like a government job. All talk, no profit." It was the kind of deadpan line that made even the agents laugh. But Hoover did not laugh. He spent the flight rewriting the arrest report to make himself look like the hero. When they landed, the Bureau held a press conference. Hoover claimed Karpis had finally surrendered after a lengthy chase. Reality check. It lasted less than 5 minutes. The irony was complete. The nation's top criminal brought down not by bullets, but by bureaucracy and a man desperate for a headline. Karpis was sentenced to life. Not for murder, but for kidnapping, a crime with more paperwork than gunfire. And Hoover, he got his photo for the history books. The director of the FBI smiling beside a calm man in handcuffs, or actually a necktie. They sent him to Alcatraz, not because this was necessary, but because Hoover wanted him buried somewhere the press could not reach. Public enemy number one, he said, deserves the rock. Karpis arrived in 1936, prisoner number 325, a quiet man with calm eyes and perfect posture. The guards were expecting a monster, but what they got looked more like a math teacher. He made no trouble. He never fought. He did not mouth off. He just watched. Alcatraz was supposed to be the place where men broke. Capone was there, and he was declining because he had syphilis, the hopeless roar of the ocean outside the cell blocks. But for Karpis, it was a laboratory, an anthropologist trapped in hell. Men in cages, he wrote later, lose their minds in the order of their intelligence. The smarter ones die slower, he said. His cell neighbor at one point was, in fact, Al Capone himself, by then a shell of a man. Capone would stand in the yard humming nursery rhymes, trying to conduct an invincible orchestra. Karpis later said, Capone looked like somebody who'd lost his lunch money. Karpis also watched Arthur "Doc" Barker die during an escape attempt in 1939, riddled by guards' bullets on the shore. The official report called it a failed breakout. Karpis called it the closest thing to freedom Doc ever got. But Alvin didn't try to escape. He didn't need to. He already outlived everyone that mattered. In prison, he became something worse than dangerous. He became educated. He read law books, learned psychology, studied finance. He could quote philosophers, analyze social decay, and draft legal motions that baffled the guards. By the 1940s, he was tutoring other inmates, and one of them was a scrawny, manipulative kid with a guitar and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His name was Charles Manson. Manson was just another hustler then, small time, insecure, always looking for an angle. Karpis taught him a few guitar chords and warned him never to trust the spotlight. Years later, when the Manson murders hit the news, Karpis said, "That little punk finally found his spotlight. I wish he had taken up the harmonica instead." He spent 26 years behind bars, 12 on Alcatraz, then McNeil Island in Washington. He became the quiet ghost of a bygone era, the last outlaw from a time when crime had style before it became industrialized. In 1969, the government paroled him. Hoover was dead by then. Poetic justice, if ever there was. Karpis was in his 60s. He walked out into a world he barely recognized. He didn't belong in an age of moon landings and color TV. He moved to Canada for a while, then to Mexico, and finally settled in Spain. He wrote 2 memoirs, Public Enemy Number 1 and On the Rock, both filled with brutal honesty about how the Bureau lied, how the newspapers were bought, and how men like him were built from desperation, not evil. He did not romanticize it. He said crime was stupid, but so was a government that left half the country starving and called it freedom. "I never killed for fun," he wrote, "but I watched plenty of men do it for paychecks." His final years were quiet, a little too quiet. In August 1979, Spanish authorities found him dead in his apartment. Pills beside the bed. Official cause, suicide. And if you're wondering it might be a conspiracy, all signs do point to suicide. No, he did not leave a note, but there was also no struggle in the apartment. His money was untouched, and his passport was left on the counter. Friends said he'd been planning another book. Others said he'd been drinking too much. "They made me a legend," he once said, "but all I ever wanted was a clean getaway." Some French accounts claim Karpis ordered a few killings, particularly of snitches or rivals. He denied this, and there's zero solid evidence. In his memoirs, he admitted that people died because of the life I chose, but always emphasized he never killed for pleasure or pride. When you stack him against the rest, Nelson's massacres, Clyde Barrow's body count, Dillinger's armed raids, Karpis comes off almost surgical. When Alvin Creepy Krampus died, the world barely noticed. No front page obituaries, no Hoover press releases, no headlines about America's last outlaw finally falling, just a short line in a Spanish newspaper, "Former gangster found dead in apartment," and that's it. For a man who once made Hoover lose sleep, his exit was as quiet as switching off a light. But maybe that's how he wanted it. Because in the end, Karpis had become something Hoover never could, self-aware. He didn't excuse his crimes. He called himself a thief, a manipulator, but he also called out the system that fed on men like him. He called out the lawmen chasing fame through blood. "I was a crook," he said. "Hoover was a salesman. We both made a living off fear." And he was not wrong. Hoover built an empire on myth, on the idea that he alone could protect America from chaos. He turned gangsters into movie villains and himself into the man who saved civilization. But behind the marble desk and the flag pin, Hoover ran a personal PR campaign, staged photographs, planted news stories, and a network of agents terrified of telling him the truth. Karpis saw through it early on. That's why Hoover hated him, because Karpis did not fit into his narrative. He wasn't a raging maniac like Babyface. He was not a tragic rebel like Dillinger. He was calm, intelligent, and worst of all, he was honest about his motives. He robbed for money, not revenge, and not for fame. He never shot a hostage, never killed a cop, never glorified violence. He outsmarted a government that could not stand being outsmarted. And in the end, he lived long enough to write it all down. That might be the cruelest victory of all. So the man they called Creepy turned out to be one of the most lucid voices of his generation, a criminal philosopher who understood power better than the men in Washington. Everyone wants control, he wrote. The difference between a gangster and a government is who gets to call it justice. But the file still whispers a truth America keeps trying to forget. The line between hero and villain is not drawn in blood, it's drawn in who gets to write the story. He did not fit the myth. 1930s made outlaws into folk heroes, dashing rebels, tragic lovers, Robin Hoods of the Dust Bowl. Karpis, he was methodical, intelligent, and quiet, but boring by Hollywood standards. No doomed romance, no blaze of glory, no poetic death or a dirt road. He didn't die young or beautifully. He got old, wrote memoirs, and told the truth, which made him unremarkable. Once Karpis was caught and Hoover got his photo, he just moved on. The Bureau quietly erased Karpis from its press circle because the real story made Hoover look incompetent. Hoover's own agents later admitted the director barely knew how to use a firearm and showed up after the arrest for the photo op. You don't put your boss's humiliation in the history books. Most criminals were emotional. Karpis was analytical. He spoke calmly about corruption, poverty, and all of the messy things that nobody likes to discuss. He could explain in perfect logic how America created the very crime it claimed to hate. That unnerved people. A killer is easy to dismiss. A criminal philosopher, well, that's dangerous. His memoir called out the FBI, the justice system, and the media machine long before it was fashionable. They didn't want to amplify that voice. We immortalize explosions, not endurance. We like hearing and reading and watching someone get shot in an alley. We want to see Bonnie and Clyde's shredded car with bullets. But Karpis, we don't want to hear about the guy who lived until his 70s, quietly with no chase scene or gunfire. He died in Spain. Officially suicide, possibly not, but again, no drama, just pills, a bed, and a mystery no one cares to solve. And guys, let's face it, that doesn't sell tickets. When he was paroled in 1969, the country had changed. Vietnam, Nixon, Manson, civil rights. Nobody wanted to hear from an old Depression-era crook who saw through Hoover 30 years too early. He wasn't part of the new mythology. He was a ghost from the one we'd already rewritten. So people forget him because he refused to play that part. He didn't feed the myth. He dismantled it, and history doesn't reward people who show the magician's hand, especially when the trick is called justice. You've been listening to Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt. If you found this story compelling, follow, rate, share on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. Search and narration is done by me, can't you tell? Sources for this episode did include Public Enemy #1 by Alvin Karpis, On the Rock by Alvin Karpis, FBI archives, and declassified Hoover-era files. And remember, the past is not dead, it's just doing time in declassified FBI files.